Okay, hello everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. My name's Chris Unit. I'm delighted you've all chosen to come along to hear about a research project looking at the impact of digital in museums and galleries. We have a running order. In a moment, I'll hand over to my colleague Georgina Brooke, along with Sarah Briggs from the Museums Association and Mike Keating from the Art Fund. They will tell you a lot more about the project as a whole and talk you through what it consisted of and what we found. After that, we're going to hear from a couple of the people who were the recipients of funding for a couple of projects to get their take on some of the issues raised. Hopefully that all sounds good to you. So we're releasing a report that summarises some of the findings and conclusions from a research project that we at One Further have been working on with our colleagues at Cultural Associates at Oxford throughout quite a fair chunk of 2022. That link is on the Art Fund and Museum Association websites. It's really important to do thank yous. I was brought up to be a polite little lad, so and it's important given the circumstances around the sector at the moment. We recognise the people that make this kind of work happen. So I really want to say thank you to Art Fund and the Museums Association who commissioned this piece of research. It's really encouraging to see this kind of joined up approach to this sort of work, and I think the sector's all the better for it. So thank you to them. We're also very grateful to the Fidelity UK Foundation for additional support for the project, and to the UK Research and Innovation, UKRI, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, AHRC, and the Esmée Fairbairn Foundation, whose funding made possible many of the projects included within the scope of the research. And finally, I just want to give a shout out to our wonderful collaborators at Cultural Associates Oxford. They're not represented on this webinar here today, so you won't hear from them over the next little while, but they were an integral part of this project and a joy to work with.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks everyone for turning up today. So as Chris mentioned, we're here to talk to you today about the outcomes of a study we undertook for Art Fund and Museum Association, looking at the last 2 years worth of funded digital projects in the sector and thinking about what we can learn from them. So how can we pay forward the successes of 2020 to 2021 with regard to digital projects, and what lessons have we learned? I'm going to hand over to Mike and Sarah now so they can introduce themselves and a bit more about the rationale for where this project came from, and then I'll be back later to tell you a bit more about what we found out.
Hi everyone, I'm Mike Keating. I am the head of digital service at Art Fund, and we're the kind of like national fundraising charity for art, and we sort of help museums and galleries like share great art and culture with everyone. You might know us from the products that we sell, the National Art Pass, which we try and sell to as many people as possible to kind of make art as accessible as possible. And then all of that money that we make from selling that pass kind of goes into all of the funding that we deliver for the sector. So a lot of you on this call might know us from having received a grant, or maybe from applying for a grant. But we also support museums in other ways through a ticketing platform called Art Tickets. We have a crowdfunding platform called Art Happens as well. And through like joining our wider network, we help promote museums and galleries across the country. I will talk a bit about kind of how 2020 changed things for us, and then kind of how we got into this particular piece of work. And yeah, I think it's like not really an understatement to say that 2020 changed basically everything for Art Fund and the way that we work. In an immediate response to the first lockdown back in March 2020 that saw like everywhere close their doors and museums and galleries across the country take hits on footfall and therefore income, we launched a program of grant making called Respond and Reimagine, and like the priority of that funding program was essentially to keep the lights on, to help museums kind of react to the situation as it unfolded through like a gradually increasing in length national lockdown. Obviously, in that time period, we saw a ton of organizations pivot to digital all of a sudden. some much more quickly than others, and some were like much more like along the like further down that journey when the first lockdown hit. But yeah, we saw like a massive switch from like organizations who'd never done any digital work before and suddenly needed to keep their audiences engaged, as well as some who were maybe a bit more sophisticated and took this opportunity, like saw this as an opportunity to kind of like clarify their digital work. So yeah, we kind of like did that for 2 funding rounds, and then gradually like began to see that a lot of museums were kind of either facing the same challenges or like on different steps of a very similar journey. And then by the time, yeah, the 3rd kind of funding round came around, we decided it was time to get our heads up, and like look at what was going on in the sector and try to evaluate the funding that we'd given out over like the previous 12 to 18 months, and kind of review what had worked so that we could share that with the sector to help better digital work to happen across the sector, but also to help us learn how to be a better funder and to understand what work we'd funded that was successful, and what was less successful, so we can fund more of the successful stuff and less of the unsuccessful stuff.
Hi there. Yeah, so I'm Sarah Briggs. I'm the Collections Development Officer for the Museums Association, and I'll tell you a little bit about our organisation and what happened with our funding in 2020 and what led us into this, this research as well, just as Mike has done. So if you're not familiar with the Museums Association, we're a membership organisation for museums and the museums workforce. And we're primarily focused on campaigning for socially impactful museums. Now, a big part of my role at the Museums Association is managing our grant programmes. A big one that I manage regularly is the Esmée Fairbairn Collections Fund, which provides funding for museums to undertake socially impactful work with their collections. And we were in the middle of a funding round for this in spring 2020 when the first lockdown hit. And we immediately felt that the current offering was not going to cut it for that year. So we rapidly changed. We were offering fewer grants of £100,000, and we decided to instead use that money to offer much more grants of £20,000 to support collections engagement when museums couldn't open their doors. Through this funding, which was hugely oversubscribed, we saw more digital work than we'd ever seen before. And we also saw that many museums just weren't that well equipped to swiftly deliver digital engagement. Now, UKRI saw this funding and saw that, you know, the sort of projects that we funded, and they approached us in 2021 to run an additional funding stream on the behalf of them and AHRC, which was part of their wider work breaking down barriers between research, innovation and society, which you can see in their new public engagement strategy. So they approached us to run the Digital Innovation and Engagement Fund, which offered grants a little bit higher of £50,000 for museums to explore digital engagement with underrepresented audiences. So that was in 2021. So this was sort of the next stage, really, after museums had done that original pivot. We saw between both of these funds that there were huge differences in the experience levels and ambition from museums that applied to us. We felt that there were some really important lessons that could be learned from these two funding streams, and we always try to use our funding to share with the wider sector, not just successful grantees, so that we felt that a little focused research could perhaps produce some interesting results for the sector. We knew that we also had a great data set, so because both of those funds were hugely oversubscribed, we knew that we had all of the applications that we could learn from, as well as the funded projects, which again were a lot more than we normally fund. So we thought that that could help provide some information on the potential of digital to reach audiences. And we know that we often learn more from projects that don't go to plan necessarily than the ones that do. So we thought it would be a good idea to help use some of the live projects as well to find out more about the barriers to this work. Back to you, Georgina.
Thank you. So in terms of the inputs we had going into this study, as Sarah and Mike have mentioned, we had access to a lot of the grantee data. So that was not just everyone that had applied for the different pots that they mentioned, but also the evaluation that the funders themselves put on those projects. So we could see the basis on which decisions were being made on what was funded and what wasn't, which was really interesting, and I think rooted this study in quite a sort of practical, realistic way. We also conducted a literature review, looking at what other research and studies had to say on the topics in question. We conducted a sector survey, which went out to those on the Art Funder Museum Association mailing list, as well as other digital cultural networks we had access to. We conducted external interviews with those we thought would have an interesting perspective on the sector as a whole, and the role of digital funded projects within it. So we spoke to a range of academics, other funders, those that had worked in a number of different types of cultural organisation, commercial entities working with cultural organisations, and so on. Another really interesting input we had into this study, which was entirely facilitated by our project partners, Cultural Associates Oxford, headed up by Lucy Shaw and her consultants, was action learning sets. So we recruited from the live funded projects from the funds that Mike and Sarah mentioned from Museum Association and Art Fund, 5 groups of 5 participants who would meet over the course of 6 weeks. Each week would begin with an opening provocation on the topics we were interested in. So that might be what does an effective post-COVID digital strategy look like? That might be how can we use digital projects to diversify our audiences? So the week would begin with an opening speaker provocation on a given topic, and then those groups would meet during the course of that week and discuss these topics, and the same cohorts would do the same thing in the same groups week on week. And this gave us a really rich and kind of dynamic data source in order to really kind of get under the hood of how people were grappling with different types of challenges in the sector, and gave us, I mean, it generated about 50 hours of recording. So it gave us a really kind of rich understanding of how people were talking on a kind of peer-to-peer basis about the problems they were facing. And it was a much sort of richer and I think more unusual input than something like the survey results, which was a much more sort of static input. So it was really useful to have that. In terms of the structure of the presentation as a whole, we're condensing quite a lot of research into 3 main different areas. So the first of those, which I'll speak about for about 4 minutes after this, is how can we measure the impact of digital projects in ways other than, for example, the financial impact? How can we measure, for instance, the social impact of digital projects? And what is the potential for digital projects to diversify audiences? So I'll take that lot first of all, and then move on to looking at monetizing digital and scaling up digital projects. And after each of these questions, I'll hand back to either Sarah or Mike for the funder's perspective on the outcomes of this research study. So first up, in terms of social impact, our main finding in this area was that creating socially valuable digital projects requires collaboration between what are often quite siloed different departments. And to illustrate this, I'm going to use an example really because it just exemplifies a lot of the findings that we found were current in the best practice examples here. So this is a screenshot from Opera North's Couch to Chorus, which you may or may not be aware of. This is an example of them doing a Zoom-based rehearsal with an amateur choral group that they've recruited online, which will ultimately culminate in a concert. So you've got all of your different parts. I believe this is the tenors, leading up to a sort of online Zoom concert at the end of it. What's clever about this is that they use digital as a means of targeting a different and more diverse audience than they usually reach. So if we think about an opera visiting audience and we look at the cost of an opera ticket, this is something that typically is something that, you know, an upper middle class audience will go to. Opera tickets are quite expensive. Opera North is based in Leeds. What was clever about this project is that it was deliberately expanding outside of that typical audience group. We saw lots of examples in lockdown of people taking projects that had worked in a physical space and putting them online without adapting them all that much. And by and large, those projects weren't very successful because they weren't thinking very intentionally about the benefits that digital can afford and how to use digital and the scale that that brings as a means of bringing in a wider audience. So just to the way that we're thinking about socially valuable digital projects is that the most successful examples exist in the intersection between these three things. And I'll use the Opera North example to kind of demonstrate these three aspects. So first of all, mission. You don't actually need to know what Opera North's mission is to understand that it makes sense for them to be running a choral group. They have expertise in this area. It stands to reason that they will deliver you a good experience on something like this. Incidentally, their mission is about diversifying, expanding the art form and diversifying audiences. So this project did make sense in terms of the direction that they were going in. I've already mentioned that in terms of audiences, this was an innovative project that diversified who they were normally speaking to. They were using digital as a means of recruiting an audience that was interested in them topically, so interested in the benefits of taking part of a choral group, but weren't necessarily based in Leeds, hadn't necessarily ever been to an opera before. So really thinking intentionally about how digital could expand their audiences whilst retaining their kind of topic niche, if that makes sense. This was run by someone with the job title Education Digital Manager, which is quite an interesting intersection between two departments that we don't always see talking to each other. So when I mentioned before the example of projects that had been run in the physical space being put online, very often those were sort of learning projects which hadn't been sort of targeted particularly well for a digital audience. So having skills in both digital and formal education, I think also lent a really useful aspect to this project and allowed Opera North to think about this project both longitudinally and qualitatively in terms of audience diversity, but also best practice in terms of digital. And they did some quite clever digital evaluation things like A/B testing donation messages. So although this was a free to access service, I believe it generated over £100,000 in voluntary donations. So yes, just to encapsulate that model for socially valuable digital projects, it should have a good sense of why this particular organisation is running this project. It should have a good sense of who this particular project is for, how to engage that audience, and how you're going to evaluate that on a sort of longitudinal or qualitative model. On the digital side, it should have a good idea of why this particular product is being used digitally, particularly now that lockdown is no longer the norm. It should have a good understanding of how to technically deliver a digital project and ideally make use of digital evaluation best practice to things like A/B testing or even usability testing.
So I'll tell you a little bit about what we're going to do with this learning at the Museums Association. So we have a history, as I've mentioned already, of trying to get as much learning out of the funded projects that we have, so that we can share that with the entire sector. And as part of that, a few years ago, we produced a toolkit for measuring social impact. It's got lots of resources in it to help the sector plan how they can measure not just the reach of their work, but the difference it can make to participants' lives, and how you can make therefore a business case for why you should be doing socially impactful work for the people that hold the purse strings, which is quite important. However, this toolkit was from the before times, so it was very much not designed with digital engagement in mind. It was very much designed with in-person engagement. So one thing we wanted to get from this research was some content and some learning so that we can update this. We know that there's loads of great tools out there to measure things like analytics, but what we're really interested in is how you can measure not just the reach of your engagement, but the depths. So it's really easy to see how many people viewed your YouTube video, for example, But if the content of that YouTube video was on something such as climate change, how do you know how many people have made tweaks to their lives, you know, and gone a bit greener as a result of that content? It's really hard to tell. So thanks to this research, we've got a whole range of new content. So in 2023, one of my first jobs will be to update this toolkit so it's more up to date, and so that it works for both in-person and digital engagement.
So next up, I'm going to spend about 4 minutes looking at the potential of digital projects to monetize. And the remit of the research question is really looking specifically at digital products. So we're not looking at things like ticketing systems or shops. We're primarily looking at new services that came to the fore during the last 2 years. So there's really two different parts to this research question. First of all, I'm going to look at examples of museums and cultural organisations that were able to generate significant revenue online. But the main finding from this research question is really that that there is quite a lot of low-hanging fruit for the majority of the sector in terms of getting the basics right. So the second part of this monetising digital section will look at that. But first up, here we've got a screenshot from London Transport Museum's Hidden London Histories Patreon account. Hidden London Histories is their YouTube series that was already very popular, very well received, not generating any revenue prior to lockdown. And Patreon, if you're not already aware of it, is an online platform that plays on the idea of patronage. And it was originally set up probably more for artists and creators. So the idea was that you could sign up on a monthly level for different levels of access, and the further up the bands you go, the more level of custom or bespoke or intimate access you get to their kind of behind the scenes creative process. So one of the innovations of the last couple of years in the cultural sector is organisations like London Transport Museum and the Tank Museum, who London Transport Museum consciously modelled themselves on in this development, using Patreon in a way to monetize the content they were creating on platforms like TikTok and YouTube. So you can see here for London Transport Museum at the £10 a month level, subscribers get Discord access, which so an instant messaging platform that allows them to engage directly and give input to the team. And by the team, they mean the creative team that produce the Hidden London Histories YouTube videos. At the £21 a month level, you get your Discord access, but you also get a monthly live stream of Patreon only Hidden London Hangouts. And as I said, that this model was derived from or closely modelled on Tank Museum's already successful Patreon account. One other example that I'm going to use for monetising digital is Oxford University Museum of Natural History's Mystery at the Museum. So this was a one-off event that landed in December 2020, so when we were in more or less full lockdown, with the presenter and celebrity Steve Backshaw, who the museum had a pre-existing relationship with. And in the event itself, families and kids could log in and answer science puzzles to allow Steve ultimately to escape the museum. It was an escape room. What was clever about this was in the build up to the event, they created a custom mailing list that was based off their existing, a subset of their existing communication channels that were specifically interested in this event. But they were also able to augment that with Steve's quite significant following as well. Whilst this event had no mandatory cost attached to it, it generated over £33,000 for that one-off event alone in voluntary donations for a cost of around £3,000. So we've deliberately chosen those three examples because they have quite a lot in terms of common threads, common patterns that we can kind of pick out of there. One of the conclusions from this study is that certainly within the last 2 years, live and interactive video does seem to be something that people are willing to pay for. And we didn't include it in the examples just now, but we could have done things like V&A Academy and other online education platforms that launched during this period. Again, that was another example where live and interactive video was something that brought in significant revenue for a cultural organisation. Similarly, characters. So the characters that appear in the Tank Museum TikTok are the same characters that users are subscribing to get more custom access to in the Patreon account. It's the same with the London Transport Museum and their YouTube account. And to the extent that Steve Backshaw is a real life personality and celebrity, you can see that that model streams through there as well. So you can see this sort of concurrent with the rise of TikTok more generally, that cultural organizations that are able to create characters associated with their brand can generate quite a lot of fandom behind them. And platforms like Patreon have demonstrated that they can, that it's possible to monetize that kind of fandom as well. But it does come with a little bit of a health warning. So London Transport Museum was one of the participants in the action learning sets, and they were we were able to talk to them about the process of setting the Patreon account up, and they were quite upfront in saying that they didn't know at the point at which they launched this platform that they would get a minimum viable number to justify all of the custom content that they were promising subscribers. So you do have to commit to delivering a certain amount of content before you know that you're going to get that base to support it. So, as I mentioned, the other side of this question is really around the situation for the majority of museums, which is there's still quite a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of getting the basics right. So by this, we've brought up 3 different examples here. So one of these would be using segmented email lists. So there's still quite a lot of instances in the cultural sector where one email is being sent out to the entire database, including in multi-site venues where audiences aren't able to input about which content is relevant to them or not. So essentially, audiences are sometimes being spammed with content that isn't relevant to them, that is about events going on at sites that are outside their home city. Similarly, most of the cultural sector do not run their own targeted advertising. If targeted advertising is being run at all, targeted digital advertising is typically being run by the wider university or council, and it's often outsourced. But if we think about something like the Opera North example, where they're trying to launch a new product around a topic that's interesting to them, but to an audience that they don't already speak to, using something like Google or Facebook advertising is a really good and sophisticated tool to reach those audiences that don't already necessarily exist on your mailing lists. And some people within the cultural sector may have a degree of nervousness about paying more money to these companies, which to some extent I empathise with, but equally the competition for audience attention with companies like Netflix, those companies are not, those for-profit companies are not going to have any qualms about using these tools to reach audiences for topics they're interested in. So it makes sense to meet people where they're at and use these tools, which are at the moment one of the more effective ways of reaching audiences that you have something topically interesting to tell them about when they're not necessarily already on your subscriber list. And finally, there's still quite a lot of examples in the sector where it takes quite a lot of work to get people to the point at which they're ready to make a donation on the website. But there's still quite a lot of examples where there are significant barriers to being able to complete those donation requests. And so you can put quite a lot of work into getting someone to the point at which they're ready to make a donation, but that can quite quickly be frustrated if there are usability barriers on those donation asks. So that's another way that low-hanging fruit in terms of monetizing income more effectively online.
Over to me. Thanks, Georgina. I just wanted to pick up on that last point that Georgina was making about like usability issues on donate forms or like ticket purchase forms, or even like shop purchases. Last week or 2 weeks ago, because time flies apparently. I was presenting at the AMA Digital Day conference about like the importance of measuring that stuff and making sure that those funnels are like working effectively. Some of that, if you haven't got that stuff set up, like if you don't have a full sense of like what your conversion rate across the journey for someone buying a ticket for an exhibition or an event is, or like converting when they go onto your online shop. Some of that stuff is surprisingly easy to set up if you are able to make the time for it. And there are some great free tools out there, like obviously Google Analytics does a good job of a lot of that stuff. But Hotjar is a much like cooler and visual tool that is available for free if you're a non-profit. You just have to Google Hotjar for non-profits, and that can give you like screen recordings of people trying to complete those journeys, so you can get a real sense of like what the technical barriers are or what the usability barriers are in those journeys. Like even some of the bigger venues in the sector, which I won't name, have honestly like some of the most frustrating experiences, like trying to buy almost literally anything. And you know, venues across the sector, like we need to make money to stay open, and there's like a clear ROI in getting some of those things fixed. In terms of like what Art Fund is looking at specifically in this area, while Georgina was talking about some kind of like new and novel approaches to some of this sort of like fundraising and almost like e-commerce, it's also important to know that like we as a funder and like support provider are kind of getting the basics right. So I mentioned at the start that we run a ticketing platform called Art Tickets. That's like 5 or 6 years old now, and so is our crowdfunding platform. So what we're having a look at, you know, like they've raised a lot of money for the sector over the last 5 or 6 years. I think Art Tickets has raised about 5 million and Art Happens somewhere in the region of 1. But they've been running for quite a while off like ideas that were had 5 or 6 years ago, and some of the features in there are maybe like less effective than they used to be, or maybe even less relevant to your organization's like broader fundraising strategy. So we're taking some time to review those. They're obviously still running, but we want to make sure that they're like delivering as much as they can for the sector. And like, do we want to build in stuff like simple online donation forms, like recurring giving forms? Do we want to help support museums with contactless donations? Like obviously raising money on site is very important, and not a lot of venues have that kind of infrastructure set up. So we're sort of looking at this problem as a like, what's the thing that we could do to solve a problem for as many different venues as possible. We're also looking into online learning. We've done a bit of this before, so just before the pandemic, and one of the first things that I worked on when I joined Art Fund was looking at this like potential e-learning platform that we might deliver. But obviously there's a lot of skills resource and like free training resources that already exist in the sector. So it's really about us identifying where the gap might be in terms of like online learning content, or if it's in like, how do we better market what already exists and get that in front of the right people. There's something that will come up a bit later in the report that we're also like very interested in around strategy, which mostly relates to digital strategy. And we know as a funder, like it becomes quite clear when you're looking at a funding application, which organizations have this piece of like digital work as part of a broader program of digital work, and which ones are kind of just like, we were told to do a website, so we're going to do a website. Better, like if an organization's got a digital strategy, it means that like their funding application around digital work is much more likely to be a much better application that's much more likely to get funded. So that's something we're definitely like keeping our eye on, and yeah, like trying to work out what our place is in helping to solve that problem.
So yeah, the last point I'm going to be talking about is how the last research question that we looked at was how digital projects can go about scaling up and what an effective post-COVID digital strategy might look like. And the main finding that we got from this part of the research was that a lot of the things we hear about in the sector at the moment, prioritization, vision, burnout, or lack of vision and burnout, really stem, or certainly the findings from this study indicate that they stem from ultimately a low confidence in strategy. And it's interesting, we presented this talk about a month ago at the Museums Computer Group conference that was called Turning It Off and On Again, Museums and the New Normal, and Kati Price from the V&A was the keynote there. And her talk built on a lot of these themes around lack of prioritization, issues around vision in the last few years, burnout in the sector most definitely. So these sort of common causes, our study strongly indicates are effects of lack of confidence in strategy. So I'm just going to take you through some of the points of how we got to that point. So we ran a sector survey where we asked participants to rate their level of confidence in different aspects of digital activity. And we can see here that relatively low confidence is expressed for things like digital experience and events and digital products, which to some extent isn't that surprising because museums by and large weren't doing these things in the main before COVID. But what was more surprising was low confidence reported in strategy. And this built on some of the comments that Museum Association made in response to the Sustaining Engagement with Collections Fund. And they said at that point, overall, we saw that lots of applications were limited in their scope in the sense that they didn't address key elements of their medium and long-term plans. And we can see how it might be difficult to build in a medium to long-term plan if you're not doing that within the context of an overarching strategy that you're confident in. And what was really interesting about this research question was when we had a week on it within the action learning sets and could ask participants and those working in cultural organisations a little bit more about this. And it was definitely clear at that point how few had things that they were sort of comfortable talking about or confident talking about in terms of their both digital strategy and organisational strategy in the last 2 years. So we heard examples of people outsourcing strategy, but then what they got back from consultants wasn't really a strategy at all. It was more a set of actions, and museums have quite a lot of actions already. So that wasn't particularly helpful. We also heard examples of museums holding back on creating a digital strategy because they were waiting for the overall organisational strategy to land, and this is in sort of June, July this year. And if we think about the number of decisions that a digital team has needed to make over the last 2 years, not having a sort of central strategy to hang that around is obviously going to be a bit debilitating in terms of how much organisational buy-in you can get behind that. And one of the most compelling data points on this was a study that was run by the Arts Council. They commissioned an independent evaluation of their digital culture network. And this survey went out to 885 cultural practitioners in about March this year. And at that point, when these participants were asked, how developed is your organisation's overall digital policy plan or strategy? 17% of respondents said they did not have one. So that was quite a sort of red flag in terms of thinking about the importance of strategy and how that might make it more difficult to plan forward a compelling funding application and a compelling long-term digital plan.
Georgina's explained strategy, you know, it's a really big part of the findings of this report, and we really want to support museums to help get this right. So we already have at the MA a Museums Essential series of online learning modules. So what we're doing now is we're going to look into whether a module on digital would be helpful that could include, you know, lots of information on how to create a digital strategy. It feels like that would be a really natural section in a course like that. We haven't got any concrete plans yet, but they are getting there. So we'll have conversations with our partners on this project, already booked in for the new year, and we're going to keep working on that. So it's definitely an avenue we're exploring. I also would like to, just so I get the opportunity to mention the changes that we've made to the collections fund for 2023 as well. So because we're continually learning from the funding as it and the fund's constantly evolves, we want to make sure it's the best fit for the sector. So in 2023, the fund is much more closely aligned to organisational strategy, which can absolutely include digital. And we want to sort of tie in with museums' EDI goals in order to support museums to reach those underrepresented audiences that I think a lot of the project we've funded in the last 2 years have made even more visible. And we're even going to offer sort of core funding for the first time as well, slightly moving away from that project-based approach to help embed this work in the sector.
Yeah, I just add on a funding note. We've just announced the kind of 4th round, the successful applicants to the 4th round of the Reimagine grant. And each time we've gone through one of those funding rounds, we've like slightly changed the focus of those to make sure that we're able to like respond to what the sector needs most. Yeah, which we think has been effective. And there's some stuff on our website around like how you might apply for similar upcoming funding programs and the kind of work that we funded in the past to give you a sense of like what might make a successful application. But just on this idea of mentorship that's up on the slide here, earlier I mentioned, you know, we were looking at some of the platforms that we've got and what's the kind of like solution that what's a solution to a problem that the sector has that, you know, we might deliver to help, you know, tackle a problem that lots of different places have all at once. There is, I think, something in that, but I think there's also a piece that we're really interested in like linking up people who've solved some of these problems themselves, or, you know, with or without our funding, because sometimes like the solution to a problem isn't necessarily a big shiny technical tool that might arrive maybe 2 years after everyone needed it. Sometimes it's just about creating a network of people who are all trying to solve the same problems, or like linking people up with people who have solved those problems. So we can kind of all share in how those kind of projects have worked, which we think will help build up, you know, the kind of skills and resilience of the sector in that respect. One of the things that was mentioned earlier by Georgina was this like burnout, like people are tired of trying to solve these problems on their own, and while creating these kind of peer networks might not be something that keeps people in the sector in the super long term, it can make some of those challenges feel a lot more manageable in the short term.
Yeah, we sort of, on that note of mentorship, we already have a network of all our funded projects. It was just for the Esmée Fairbairn projects, but all of those UKRI funded digital innovation and engagement projects were all incorporated into that network, and we've seen loads of great examples of sharing. So yeah, you know, why reinvent the wheel if someone's already done it? So yeah, we have lots of conversations between the MA and the Art Fund. So we, you know, we'll certainly be sharing how that works for us, and how it helps our grantees share their, you know, their project experiences.
Yeah, because I feel like we've covered a fair bunch of this stuff, but I just wanted to add something on cost of living. Because in the report, one of the things that you might see referred to is, like, as part of the literature review for this project, there was a finding, I think from maybe late 2020, that suggested there was like a relatively strong percentage of people then who were willing to kind of pay for content, be that kind of artist exclusives or kind of behind the scenes content or live content, certainly in the era of like where lockdowns were the norm. That obviously feels quite different now. And yeah, like there's some recent reports like the Lloyd's Consumer Digital Report, which kind of suggested back in May that a third of people in this country would look to reduce their access to the internet to save money on their bills. That probably looks like either reducing the speed of like their broadband packages or reducing their mobile data. So if people are doing that, in amongst all the other cost of living challenges that they face, they're probably unlikely to pay for content that they were getting for free. And this is kind of reinforced by some audience agency research in their autumn cultural participation report that showed, yeah, like 92% of people surveyed there were looking to scale back entertainment spending. And to Georgina's point earlier about like, you know, a lot of people see what we do and our venues as entertainment, and we are to some extent competing with organizations like Netflix for people's time and for their money. If you have any plans to charge people for stuff that they're getting for free, maybe now's not the time.
So fantastic. What we really wanted to do as part of this is not just to hear from ourselves and Art Fund and Museums Association, but to hear from some of the organisations who've been recipients of funding and get their take on some of the issues and findings that were raised in the report as well. So I am hugely delighted to welcome Sam Beath from Manchester Museums. Hello, Sam.
Hello.
The technology is working seamlessly today. Thanks very much for coming along. Can you just introduce yourself and maybe a little bit about Manchester Museum for those who don't already know?
Yeah, so I'm Sam Beath. I'm Head of Conservation and Collection Care Manager at Manchester Museum. And I think a lot of people might know that we're going through a major redevelopment at the moment. I've been shut for 2 or 3 years. We're reopening very shortly in the end of February, which seems to be coming very close very soon. And during the last 12 months, I've been involved with one of these projects called Touching Perspectives now, because that's a much better name that was created by the students than the one we initially gave it. We changed it to that. And I think I'm lucky to work at Manchester Museum because I think we, as different types of disciplines, we're allowed to sort of cross boundaries, because you might not think, you know, me being head of conservation, I would necessarily be doing a digital project, but it's research, tangible sort of haptic research I've been involved with for a long time, which has been encouraged by Nick before Esmée, and Esmée sort of supported it recently. So I think that is very much a mindset at the museum that allows us to create quite creative projects that sort of span different areas. So, you know, we all work very closely with curatorial team and education and learning, but also the visitor outreach. So everybody's involved in these types of projects. So that's partly why it was initiated from us, I think.
And can you tell us a little bit about Touching Perspectives and what it is?
Yeah, so like I said, as sort of head of conservation, I've been very involved with working with objects for 30 years almost, and a lot of the haptic sensory research has come out of me working with objects, but also, you know, conservation is routinely the department that says, no, you can't touch that object. So over the years, I've tried to find ways of creating that sort of connection with objects, with visitors and objects. And I've been very involved with sort of 3D scanning and replication for the last sort of 25 years. And this sort of tangible haptic research has come out of that. So the Touching Perspective project is creating 3 tangible digital touch replicas of objects that will go back into galleries. But the digital part of it, it's not only the sort of electronics and the software, which I work with very good freelancers to do that, but it's co-curating content with neurodivergent groups that we've sort of got associations with over the last, well, probably 3 or 4 years actually. So it's come out of that.
So have you been working with the same individuals for 3 or 4 years through that?
Well, I think with any of these projects, you know, when you work outside the museum, it's really important to find colleagues in different schools and you know, whatever sort of group you're working with that really understand the sort of impact it will have on their students. And we've been really looking to work with a couple of teachers at the Grange School for Autism for the last 4 or 5 years. At the museum as well, we've got Pink Art College, which has students that have you know, mental health issues, and they've got a sort of space in the museum now, and we work with those students as well. So it's working with those groups that you need to build up a relationship with and a trust with, and that takes time. And I think that's one thing that's been really important about this project, that over that 12 months we built up those relationships with the young students at the Grange and the sort of older ones at Pink College, and that's been vital really, to then allow them to create content in a way that they're comfortable with.
I think it was really interesting over the summer when you were taking part in the action learning sets, is your perspective on what a digital project is and can be within a museum sector, because I think a lot of the discourse around digital and technology in an abstract way, it gets tied in with huge reach and potential monetization and all of these kinds of issues, which did play into some of the scope of the project that we've done. But digital can also mean deepening the experience that people can have and giving people an experience they wouldn't already have been able to have within a gallery setting, which I thought was really interesting and came at it from quite a different viewpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a sort of the fact that we're encouraged as a museum in different departments to think about, because, you know, we work in a museum all the time, we work with the public, we work with colleagues, so we do get a different perspective on how we can input into those discourses, really. And the work that we're doing with the neurodivergent students and adults has sort of partly come out of that, because I was working trying to create resources for the visually impaired, and it's that sort of sensory element that you can't get through the internet. You know, if you go into a museum, 99% of the stuff you can't touch. You know you might have a 3-line label, and that's not necessarily going to suit every. And there are, I'm not saying there's amazing digital projects out there, so I'm not sort of dismissing that. This sort of hopefully can complement those sorts of resources, but that sensory element is missing. And we found with talking to the teachers that sensory element is really important to some children that have neurodivergent needs, and the fact that the replicas that I've been making are quite robust as well. So there isn't that sort of anxiousness around parents worrying about how children are going to interact with them as well. So it's that sort of, and then the content coming back out of them. And we've still got to do a lot of evaluation about how, you know, how that works and how sort of impactful it is. You know, that means something to them because they've created it in a way that makes sense to them as well. So
interestingly, you bring up the evaluation. I think one of the things that we found through the report is that evaluating the social impact of these kind of projects can be tricky for some digital projects, whereas with the kind of work that you're doing, which is much more high touch and over a longer period, it's you're closer to the participants, so you're able to understand what kind of impact that you've had. Does it seem simpler to do that? Is that something that you think about?
I mean, the other thing about this project is that I've actively tried to find and have been working with early museum sort of what's the word, colleagues that have neurodivergent, so two colleagues that have are considered themselves to be autistic, you know, have autistic traits. So they're evaluating it from their perspective, and they definitely fed into it in the beginning about how we should work with the students, you know, what sort of outputs we should be looking for, and we've got an MA project coming out of it. Becky, who's early years museum professional, is doing her MA on looking at the evaluation about how the colleagues see the project and the teachers and what their aspirations are for it. So that's one aspect, but the really important bit is, you know, also is how is it going to impact people on the gallery, and having that content available to them almost semi-permanently on the gallery, which it isn't at the moment. And that's, you know, we do really good sessions, but those aren't always available at the time people need them. So actually having content there and on demand is something that we're keen to evaluate.
And from the point of view of this being a digital project with some quite specialised skills involved on that side of things, have there been any obstacles that you've encountered over your time?
We've got a couple of really good freelancers who I've been working with for the last sort of 6-7 years, because they've also been involved in sort of 3D haptic interfaces, which is something different. They're freelancers. The cost of living is impacting on that. You know, they're looking to have full-time jobs elsewhere, trying to get their time, you know, closer to openings, becoming, you know, sort of problematic at the moment. So I think, you know, they're on their own. They don't work for big organisations, so they're also having to try and fit this in sometimes with other types of work, which is difficult. And if, you know, if they end up having full-time jobs elsewhere, that's a very specialist skill that would be lost because it is quite niche. Yeah.
We heard that quite a bit, that some of this can be a little bit precarious because of all that. It really does depend on who you can bring around a project at what time. And I suppose that would also impact on further plans. And although I said that it's not really the kind of project that's aiming to reach mass adoption in internationally or anything, but what kind of plans or ambitions have you got for taking this on further?
So, I mean, I think there's a lot of potential for the sort of building narratives from a single object. So making those available for people with different types of needs, whether it's visual impairment or even neurodivergent or a different language, or, you know, those that's what digital is great at. I think the thing for us is seeing if we can do more of a tour in the museum where we have, you know, 20 objects rather than 3, where people can use the objects as a way of accessing the rest of the case, you know, if there's just that one narrative on the object. So there's a lot of evaluation work that we can do afterwards on content and impact. But the other thing that we've done with the touch replicas is have one in the school, because, you know, we've had the teacher be really committed, and, you know, we've done 7 workshops over the last 12 months, which is a lot, you know, their mornings that they've given up to do it. And the kids have been really engaged, and they haven't just learned about the digital side of things. They've learned about museums and, you know, the different colleagues coming in. We've done some carving, you know, we've done lots of things, because I think having that sort of, you know, it's all based around understanding the objects and the collections as well. Just having all of that different inputs allows them to have a greater understanding of the museum in general. So having that object at school, they're also talking to their other classmates. It's a physical thing that sits there that the teacher talks about. And then once we're open, you know, we're hoping that some of the kids will, if they're keen to, you know, show their families around or show other students around while they're there. So it's not just the digital content, it's much broader than that.
And I think that came through when we started looking at all the projects that had been funded, that we were going to be looking at the diversity of the projects and the audiences that they were going to be reaching really came through. And we can sometimes say that digital is too big a catch-all to have any kind of meaning, as much as museum. There's so much difference between museums, from the nationals to the voluntary run to the participatory to the solely online, that having this project as part of it, and to think about what some of the considerations are for what is probably at heart more of a participatory, very closely audience-focused project, but with a significant digital aspect to it as well.
Yeah, I mean, we have got aspirations to put the 3D files and all of the narratives online as well, and whether we do that before we reopen, I can't say, because we've got 8 weeks, and I'm head of conservation. We've got to get objects back. So we're really wanting to put all of the digital content online. So it'll be, it will be available for people. It's just when at the moment. So.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. The other person that I'd like to introduce to is Nicola Henderson from Museums and Heritage Highland. Hi, Nicola. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm well, thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Yeah, can you introduce yourself and where you work and all that kind of thing?
Yeah, I'm Nicola Henderson. Thanks, Chris. I work on a freelance basis with heritage organisations across the north of Scotland. One of the roles that I'm here to speak about today is as the Innovation and Network Manager for Museums and Heritage Highland. Museums and Heritage Highland is quite a new organisation. We just launched in October 2019 at what was the newly reopened Gairloch Museum that went on to win Art Fund Museum of the Year. And we set out to be a vehicle to strengthen the heritage sector in the Highlands for the benefit of everyone living in and visiting the region. The work that we do comes from our membership. We're very much bottom up. So they feed in and help us shape our work plans. And that work is focused around helping them to raise standards, engage with more people, collaborate with each other, and to be more sustainable and resilient. And I guess we were really just getting established when the pandemic hit, and our response was quite reactive to the situation that we found ourselves in. And we looked to find ways to support the people, the staff and volunteers working in the sector, through online heritage cafes, through advocating for the support that they needed, to understanding the new world they were operating in, and upskilling the sector, particularly in areas of digital, because while we had a few museums operating confidently in that area, the vast majority weren't really. And so our focus was finding ways for them to stay connected to each other as a means for peer-to-peer support, to their colleagues, to if they have a small staff team, although many of our museums are voluntary run, and of course to their audiences as well.
I was saying with Sam getting her perspective through the action learning sets was really interesting from that kind of project, but yours was really interesting as well, because you've got that viewpoint over different organizations who have different levels of digital capability. And
right.
When you're trying to serve everyone and bring everyone and not leave anyone behind, that comes with challenges.
Very much so, yeah. And that's where we feel like working collaboratively together at all levels, everybody has an equal voice, it is really important. Everybody brings different skills, but there are great capacity challenges at all levels, whether that is in the skills that they have within their organisations, within the finance that they have, within the time that they have. So it's just really, it's hard to compare any two organisations. Their models are all different. The skills they have within those models, and they can be very transient as well. You can have somebody who comes in volunteering, hugely passionate and confident in one area, and then perhaps for whatever reason they move on, and then you lose that very suddenly. So one of our real aims is to try and support that kind of fabric so that it feels a bit more stable, that if you do lose the skills, we know who to contact with across the network and across the region to help try and keep everybody moving forward in the areas that they want to.
One of the things that we discussed quite a bit through the action learning sets was the repercussions of quite short-term funding for digital work in the sector. As someone who works across lots of organisations, is trying to run projects that have received funding, and as a freelancer yourself as well, how do you see that impacting on the work that gets done in the sector?
Yeah, it can feel just a lot of short-termism. There can be a great idea, a bit of passion, perhaps a response to a situation that a museum finds themselves in, and they may be lucky enough to get some investment within that, and they will achieve great things with it. But unfortunately, after that, the people who are invested in the projects perhaps move on, and the skills aren't necessarily embedded within the organisation and within the region. And that's so the project that we've received some funding on from the Art Fund and Museums Association at the moment, and are slap bang in the middle of, is looking to try and embed that so that it isn't lost when the funding's finished, so that it can sort of continue and try and find a way that helps these museums to keep growing and developing and being ambitious in those areas.
And in terms of, you mentioned trying to embed skills across museums, what kind of things have you seen work, and are there areas where you just think that it's an intractable problem and there isn't necessarily an easy solution for it?
I would agree that there isn't an easy solution for it, but what we have seen work is not many of our museums, some don't have a curator, very few will have a dedicated conservator, definitely won't have somebody that just does digital quite often. So one of our new initiatives at the moment is we've created a residency programme called Breathing Space, where we invite manager curators to step out for like a 2-week residency over the weekend, to take time out to share their challenges and skills. And that's because when you come in as a manager curator in a Highland museum, you are probably doing a bit of the curation, the accreditation process, the fundraising, the marketing, the digital, on the front desk, welcoming the customers, the volunteer management. It's a very diverse role. And so we're trying to create a kind of network of people who have those expertise in different areas. So we have a conservator who's trained, she works in other museums, but then we also work on a freelance basis where she can share those skills around, or we as MHH will have a project that comes in for her to work, do some training, skills and sharing. And the same within digital as well, where we have a couple of new people who've moved to the area who have great skills within digital. And it's how can we share that learning across our network and build that kind of scaffolding or a sort of ecosystem where we share those skills around that will hopefully help combat those problems.
think that kind of network consortium partnership approach is really interesting.
It's not a perfect model because there's then demands on that time and different priorities at different times and different stages. However, it definitely helps support, because we find is through a kind of skills bank of being able to sort of buy in a bit of that time and support it. And then hopefully if you have those skills a bit more embedded, and even so, for example, through the Museum of the Highland Digital Learning Hub project that we've got funding for here, where we brought in digital education specialists, they're working with the museums to sort of upskill them and what that means. Many won't have an education specialist, let alone a digital specialist or somebody that is experienced in those areas. Is sort of one, documenting, capturing their research process and consulting schools, consulting families, deciding on themes and activity plans, and then also templates for how those can look, so that again the museums take away that kind of package. So as well as the end resource of having the digital learning hub online as something that can be used and promoted, there are then the skills within the museums to hopefully keep adding to that and developing it themselves.
And have you got, we're talking about the how long funding streams can last sometimes. Have you got plans for ongoing sustainability of these projects?
Yeah, well, we're looking at sponsorship at the moment, and we're pitching to a couple of people who are interested, and so they can bring in just a small amount every month, that helps us with both developing the content for it ongoing, because we don't see it as being an end product. Then there may be more objects we wish to digitize, more stories, more activities to be created, and also in terms of a web developer, so that they can keep adding into it and it doesn't pull away from anyone's time of having to do it, or it sits there, and after sort of a push it's then out in the world. So we're hoping that is a way that on a long-term basis we can keep generating income, as well as using it potentially for match where there are specific projects that we want to do, that we could add content to it for.
Is that sponsorship on a kind of individual people basis, or commercial sponsorship?
Commercial.
Oh, interesting.
Looking at this stage, I mean, that's the main monetization driver, is looking at that kind of commercial sponsor. I guess we were slightly inspired by, if Samsung can sponsor the British Museum, why not a collection of 17 museums from across the Highlands? And fortunately the conversations are quite positive there, because that's again another thing about scaling up, about working together. We have a louder voice, a larger demographic, so therefore we can hopefully attract a larger commercial sponsor. But also part of the website has a way to connect for people through virtual and digital visits that will be paid for, and therefore that's a kind of a direct income stream to the museums as well.
Thank you for coming along. We're going to have to wrap things up now. The time has flown by. Thank you so much for joining us. We've had an overwhelmingly large number of people who joined us at the beginning, are still here. And I wanted to just give a little emoji round of applause to Mike and Sarah and Sam and Nicola and Georgina for all of their insights today and for being so interesting. So thank you everyone for coming along. Thanks for your questions and your comments. And let's hope this conversation carries on later too.